There exists, in every morning, a brief and almost imperceptible interval that most people pass through unconsciously, a silent window in which a man's future is either deliberately shaped or quietly surrendered. It appears insignificant. It does not announce itself with urgency. Yet within that overlooked hour begins everything a man claims to desire. The majority awaken in a state of reaction. They react to noise, to obligations, to pressures already waiting for them before they have even gathered possession of their own thoughts. And by the time their minds become clear enough to think independently, the direction of the day has already been determined by forces outside themselves. But there is another manner of living, one in which a man decides first before the world has an opportunity to decide for him. At 5 a.m., a remarkable transformation occurs. The world grows quiet, yet the mind becomes more powerful, more alert, more precise, more powerful, more alert, more precise, more capable of perception. Within that stillness, a man begins to observe what others overlook. He recognizes patterns, possibilities, and pathways that reveal themselves only to those disciplined enough to arrive before distraction begins. You have likely been taught that success belongs solely to those who labor hardest. Work longer, push further, remain constantly occupied. But suppose that is incomplete. Suppose the true distinction lies not merely in effort, but in timing. Suppose those who rise above the majority simply begin before the majority has awakened. Consider this carefully. Every significant achievement first exists as a thought, and thoughts in their earliest form are fragile. They require silence, space, and uninterrupted reflection in order to develop. Yet most people deny themselves these conditions. They rush immediately into activity, drowning their own ideas before those ideas have had the chance to become clear. Rush immediately into activity, drowning their own ideas before those ideas have had the chance to become clear. Now imagine the opposite. Imagine rising while the world remains still, before doubt, before distraction, before fear. You sit alone with your thoughts, and for perhaps the first time, you are no longer reacting, you are creating. No longer following or creating. No longer following, but choosing. There was once a man who possessed neither wealth nor influence. He had no powerful connections, no visible advantage, and no clear guarantee of success. Yet he possessed one rare quality, a decision so definite that it refused to wait for ideal conditions. Instead of moving when it was convenient, he moved when it was necessary. He did not wait for permission. He did not wait to feel prepared. He did not wait for certainty. He acted while circumstances still appeared impossible. And this is the element most people fail to understand, not the opportunity itself, not even the result, the ways, but the precise moment in which he chose to act. For the truth, though seldom acknowledged, is this. Most people do not fail because they lack intelligence or capability. They fail because they hesitate precisely when action is required. They postpone, they doubt, they negotiate endlessly with themselves. And in that hesitation, they lose the very opportunity they had hoped to find. The habit of rising at 5 a.m. is not merely a matter of discipline. It is a matter of positioning yourself before life begins pulling you in every direction. It is the act of entering the day as the author of your actions, rather than as a character reacting to circumstance. And when practiced consistently, subtle but profound changes begin to occur. Not suddenly, not dramatically, quietly. Your thinking becomes sharper, your decisions become firmer, your sense of direction becomes unmistakably clear, and gradually, almost without noticing it, you begin separating yourself from the majority. Most people spend their lives chasing visible results, but the few who understand the deeper principle focus instead on creating the conditions from which those results naturally emerge. They do not wait for opportunity to announce itself. They become the kind of person capable of recognizing opportunity when it appears. Opportunity is rarely loud. It does not introduce itself with certainty. It arrives quietly, often disguised, and only those who are mentally, emotionally, and strategically prepared are capable of recognizing its true nature. And preparation is never formed in chaos. It is formed in silence, in the early hour, in the moments when no one is watching, no one is demanding, and no one is distracting. That is where clarity is developed. That is where decisions are made. You may believe this practice is merely a habit. You may believe this practice is merely a habit, simply waking earlier, simply gaining additional hours. But it is far more than that. It is a transformation of identity. It is a declaration to yourself that you are no longer willing to live as most people live, delaying, drifting through each day without intention. Because once a man gains control over his mornings, he begins gaining control over something far greater: his direction, his concentration, and ultimately his future. From that moment forward, the results he experiences are no longer accidental. They become intentional. There is a reason the majority approach life in reverse. They wait until they feel prepared. They wait until everything appears logical. They wait until conditions become favorable. Yet, by the time certainty arrives, the opportunity itself has often disappeared. Those who rise early understand a different principle. They do not wait for clarity, they create it. They do not wait for confidence, they cultivate it. They do not wait for opportunity, they prepare themselves before it arrives. And this is where life begins to change fundamentally. For the moment a man ceases living reactively, the moment he begins deciding before the world interferes, he steps onto an entirely different path. A path where his actions are no longer controlled by circumstance, but by deliberate intention. At first, it will not feel comfortable. It will not feel natural. But neither does growth, neither does transformation. The discomfort experienced in the early hour is the very force that begins reshaping the man you are becoming. And over time, something extraordinary occurs. You stop chasing. You stop waiting. You stop asking whether life will ever change, because you finally understand that the change was never external. It was always contained within the moment you chose to take command while the world was still asleep and everything remained possible. Through more than 25 years devoted to studying the difference between men who achieve greatly and men who fail repeatedly, I have observed that the distinction rarely begins in the marketplace. It begins in the silent hour when a man stands alone with his thoughts before the world has had the opportunity to impress upon him its fears, distractions, and doubts. Every morning contains a moment so subtle that most pass through it without awareness. No noise announces it. No urgency marks its arrival. Yet within that moment lies the first and perhaps most important decision of the day: whether a man shall govern himself or surrender himself to circumstance. I have seen men of remarkable ability destroy their progress before breakfast, not because they lacked intelligence, but because they allowed the day to begin before first placing their own minds under disciplined command. They rose not with purpose, but with reaction. They listened not to their own ambitions, but to the demands already waiting for them. The early hour, the hour before the world begins its clamor, is the only period in which a man may stand in complete authority over his own mind. It is then that he may ask himself honestly and without interruption, what do I truly want? What am I willing to give in return? What specific action must I take today to move closer toward the object of my pursuit? Most men avoid these questions not because they are difficult, but because they require definiteness. And definiteness, once accepted, removes every excuse for delay. It is far easier to drift through the day, permitting events to shape one's direction, than it is to rise before the world and shape that direction deliberately. Success is never the product of chance, nor merely of favorable conditions. It is the result of a man's ability to organize his thoughts around a definite purpose and direct those thoughts with persistence. And the early hour provides the ideal environment for such organization because it exists free from interference. I recall a man who began with neither money, influence, nor position. To the casual observer, he appeared indistinguishable from the countless individuals who drift through life waiting for fortune to change. Yet there existed one critical difference, small in appearance, immense in consequence. He had made a decision, not a temporary wish, not a passing impulse, a decision formed in silence, strengthened through repetition, and fixed so firmly within his mind that circumstance itself could not weaken it. While others slept, he reflected upon his aim. While others delayed, he determined his direction. He did not begin with advantage. He began with clarity. And clarity, when united with persistence, possesses a force greater than wealth or influence. For the man who knows precisely what he wants cannot easily be diverted. Once organized, his thoughts begin attracting the means necessary for their fulfillment. And it is within the early hour that such clarity is born. Freed from the noise of the world, the mind becomes receptive. Thoughts take form with greater precision. Ideas emerge without confusion. For perhaps the first time, a man begins to see the path before him not as a vague possibility, but as a definite direction. I must emphasize that the value does not lie merely in its position on the clock. Its value lies in its condition. It is a period of silence and stillness in which the mind may function without interruption. And within that condition, a man either takes possession of his thoughts or abandons them entirely. Those who neglect this hour often believe they are saving time. They rise later, rush immediately into activity, and spend the remainder of the day attempting to recover the order they never established in the beginning. Their actions become scattered. Their decisions lose firmness. They mistake motion for progress. But the man who rises before the demands of the day places himself in a position of distinct advantage. He does not begin by reacting. He begins by deciding. And this single distinction repeated daily creates a separation so significant that effort alone cannot overcome it. Others will eventually notice the change, though they may fail to understand it. Creates a separation so significant that effort alone cannot overcome it. Others will eventually notice the change, though they may fail to understand its cause. They will observe that he speaks with greater certainty, that his actions follow a consistent direction, that he no longer hesitates when opportunity appears. Many will attribute his progress to luck or hidden advantage, never realizing that its origin lies in the quiet hour, they themselves ignored. The truth is simple, though rarely accepted. A man who does not control the beginning of his day will never fully control its conclusion. And a man who does not control his own thoughts will eventually find those thoughts controlled by external forces. The early hour is the only time in which such control may be established without resistance. Therefore, I say to you with the conviction born from long observation, do not permit another day to begin without first claiming this hour as your own. Do not rise as a servant of circumstance. Rise as the architect of your actions. Decide your actions. Decide before the world decides for you. For greatness is not formed in the crowded hours of activity. It is formed in the silent moment when no one is watching, no one is questioning, and no one is interfering, the moment in which a man develops the habits of thought that ultimately determine destiny. And once a man has learned to stand alone with his thoughts and direct them deliberately, he has taken the first and most essential step toward mastery over himself. From that point forward, the world no longer shapes him. Slowly, steadily, and inevitably, he begins to shape the world. When a man has once established authority over the beginning of his day, he soon discovers that discipline alone is not enough. Discipline creates structure, but structure without direction becomes empty routine. Many rise early for a season, yet achieve little because they mistake repetition for progress. They preserve the habit but lose the purpose that gave the habit meaning. The early hour was never intended to become mechanical. It was meant to become transformational. A man must therefore ask himself not merely whether he has awakened early, but whether he has awakened intentionally. There exists a dangerous tendency among ambitious people to fill every moment with activity. They believe movement itself is evidence of advancement. Yet, activity without alignment often produces exhaustion rather than achievement. One may spend years working diligently while moving steadily away from the life he intended to create. The disciplined man understands a deeper principle. Before effort can produce meaningful results, thought must first establish direction. For this reason, the early hour should not begin with noise or stimulation. It should begin with examination. A man must learn to sit quietly enough to observe the condition of his own mind. He must notice where his attention has drifted, where fear has entered unnoticed, where distraction has slowly weakened his purpose. Most never perform this examination. They continue forward automatically, repeating familiar actions while wondering why their circumstances remain unchanged. But transformation never begins outwardly. It begins internally through awareness. I have observed that highly successful men possess an unusual relationship with solitude. They do not fear silence as the average man fears it. Instead, they use silence as a tool. In silence, they think more clearly. In silence, they recognize errors before those errors become consequences. In silence, they reconnect themselves to the purpose that first set them into motion. The world exerts constant pressure upon the mind. Opinions compete for attention. Fear spreads rapidly. Distraction presents itself endlessly. And without deliberate periods of withdrawal, a man gradually loses possession of his own thinking. He begins adopting the priorities, anxieties, and limitations of those around him without even realizing it. This is why the early hour carries such extraordinary power. It protects the mind before the world has an opportunity to influence it. During that period, a man may strengthen his convictions before criticism weakens them. He may reinforce his vision before distraction scatters it. He may decide who he intends to become before circumstance attempts to decide on his behalf. There is another truth which must also be understood. A man's future is shaped less by dramatic decisions than by repeated daily agreements with himself. Each morning he either strengthens trust within his own mind or weakens it. When he rises as promised, acts as planned, and follows through despite resistance, he sends a message to himself that his word carries authority. Over time, this creates inner stability, a form of confidence that no external approval can provide. But when he repeatedly delays, negotiates, and abandons the commitments he made privately, he begins weakening the relationship with himself. Doubt increases, hesitation grows stronger. Even small decisions begin requiring unnecessary effort because internally, trust has been broken. This explains why so many people appear motivated temporarily yet struggle to sustain momentum. Their greatest obstacle is not lack of talent, it is inconsistency in self-command. The man who masters the early hour gradually eliminates this weakness. He becomes reliable first to himself and eventually to others, and reliability is one of the rarest forms of power in the modern world. Most people operate according to mood. They act when inspired and retreat when challenged. But the disciplined man no longer waits for emotional certainty before taking action. He understands that feelings are unstable while purpose must remain fixed. Therefore, he acts according to decision rather than emotion. This distinction separates professionals from dreamers. Dreamers wait until conditions feel favorable. Professionals begin regardless of conditions. I have seen ordinary men surpass individuals of far greater intelligence simply because they developed the habit of consistent execution. They did not possess extraordinary gifts. They simply learned to continue when others stopped. And over time, persistence created an advantage that talent alone could not overcome. The early hour trains this persistence. Each morning presents a quiet test. Will you obey comfort or purpose? Will you return to sleep or rise toward the life you claim to desire? At first, the decision appears small, but repeated over months and years, it shapes identity itself. A man becomes what he repeatedly proves himself to be. If he continually chooses comfort, he develops dependence upon ease. If he continually chooses discipline, he develops strength. And strength, once established, influences every area of life. His thinking becomes more decisive. His standards become higher. His tolerance for distraction diminishes. He no longer wastes energy attempting to impress others because he is occupied building something more important, mastery over himself. This is why true growth often appears invisible in the beginning. The greatest change often appears invisible in the beginning. The greatest changes occur internally, long before they become visible externally. A seed develops beneath the ground before it ever breaks the surface. Likewise, the disciplined man develops inwardly before the world recognizes his transformation. Others may observe only the visible outcomes. improved finances, stronger relationships, increased influence, but they fail to see the private habits from which those outcomes emerged. They see the result. They do not see the mornings. Yet, every remarkable achievement is built upon unseen decisions repeated consistently over time. The early hour is where those decisions are made. It is where character is strengthened. It is where intention becomes action. And eventually, it is where an ordinary man separates himself permanently from the version of himself that once lived without direction. For there comes a moment in every disciplined life when the individual realizes something profound. The purpose of mastering the morning was never merely to become more productive. It was to become more conscious, more deliberate, more capable of directing thought, action, and attention toward a meaningful aim. And once a man reaches this understanding, he no longer views the early hour as sacrifice. He views it as freedom. Because while the majority remain controlled by impulse, distraction, and circumstance, he has learned to stand apart from the noise and govern himself intentionally. And a man who can govern himself possesses a power few will ever understand, but everyone will eventually feel. Once a man begins to govern himself consistently, he encounters a realization that alters the way he sees the world entirely. He recognizes that life responds differently to those who move with clarity. Circumstances that once appeared random begin revealing patterns. Opportunities that once seemed rare begin appearing with increasing frequency. Not because the world has suddenly changed, but because his perception has changed. The undisciplined mind overlooks what the prepared mind immediately recognizes. Most people move through life in a reactive state, consumed by urgency, distracted by noise, and exhausted by constant stimulation. Their attention is scattered across countless directions. As a result, even when opportunity appears directly before them, they fail to identify it. The disciplined man develops another advantage. He learns to observe before reacting. This ability alone separates leaders from followers. A reactive individual is controlled by the intensity of the moment. He responds impulsively. He speaks prematurely. He changes direction repeatedly based upon temporary feelings or external pressure. But the man who has trained himself in the early hour acquires emotional distance. He no longer permits every circumstance to dictate his state of mind. He pauses, he examines, he decides deliberately. Such composure appears almost unnatural in a world addicted to immediacy. Others may mistake it for coldness or detachment, when in truth, it is control. The disciplined man has learned that every reaction carries consequences, and therefore he refuses to surrender his judgment to temporary emotion. This becomes especially important during periods of difficulty, for adversity reveals what comfort conceals. Anyone can appear focused when conditions are favorable. Anyone can speak confidently when results arrive quickly. But pressure exposes the true condition of the mind. It reveals whether a man has merely practiced discipline occasionally or whether discipline has become part of his character. I have often observed that failure rarely destroys a man in a single moment. More often, it weakens him gradually through discouragement. Small disappointments accumulate. Delays create frustration. Uncertainty breeds emotional fatigue. Eventually, many abandon their purpose because the goal was impossible, but because they allowed temporary discomfort to redefine their identity. The disciplined man responds differently. He understands that difficulty is not evidence that he should stop. It is evidence that growth is occurring. Iron strengthens through resistance, character develops through challenge, and clarity deepens through persistence under pressure. This understanding changes the meaning of hardship entirely. Obstacles are no longer interpreted as personal attacks from life itself. They become training. They become refinement. They become opportunities to strengthen qualities that comfort could never produce. The early hour prepares a man for this perspective because it teaches him daily how to overcome resistance before the world even awakens. Every morning contains resistance, the desire to remain comfortable, the temptation to delay, the voice suggesting that effort can wait until tomorrow. When a man repeatedly overcomes these impulses, he develops proof within himself that he is capable of acting regardless of how he feels. This internal proof becomes invaluable during larger struggles later in life. For confidence is not built through positive thinking alone. It is built through evidence. evidence created by repeated acts of self-control. A man trusts himself after he has witnessed himself endure discomfort voluntarily and continue moving forward regardless. Without such evidence, confidence remains fragile. It collapses under pressure because it was never rooted in experience. But disciplined action creates a foundation that external circumstances cannot easily shake. There is another change that gradually occurs within the man who protects his mornings. His relationship with time begins to transform. Most people experience time as something pursuing them relentlessly. They rush constantly, yet remain behind. They feel overwhelmed, yet accomplish little of lasting significance. Days blur together because they live without deliberate structure. But the disciplined man begins living differently. He no longer allows the day to consume him randomly. He assigns direction to his hours. He recognizes that attention is among the most valuable resources he possesses, and therefore guards it carefully. This is why highly focused individuals often appear calm, in enormous responsibility. Their energy is not scattered across meaningless concerns. They have learned to eliminate what is unnecessary and to preserve strength for what matters most. The average person underestimates how much of life is lost through distraction, not through dramatic failure, through divided attention. A distracted mind struggles to produce meaningful work because depth requires uninterrupted concentration. Great ideas, important decisions, and creative breakthroughs rarely emerge from fragmented thinking. They emerge from sustained focus, and sustained focus becomes increasingly rare in a world designed to interrupt it continuously. The early hour protects against this fragmentation. It creates a period in which the mind may think deeply before the demands of the world begin competing for attention. This depth of thought eventually produces another powerful quality: discernment. The disciplined man becomes more selective. He chooses his commitments carefully. He becomes cautious about where he invests energy, attention, and emotion. He no longer says yes automatically. He no longer pursues every opportunity simply because it appears attractive in the moment. Instead, he asks a different question. Does this align with the direction I have chosen? Most people never ask this question. As a result, they spend years climbing ladders they never truly intended to climb. They pursue goals inherited from social pressure rather than personal conviction. And eventually, even success feels empty because it was disconnected from purpose. But the man who spends time each morning examining his thoughts develops increasing clarity regarding what truly matters to him. And clarity simplifies life. Not because fewer responsibilities exist, but because confusion no longer dominates decision-making. This simplicity creates power. A focused man moves faster than a distracted one, even when appearing slower externally, because his energy flows consistently in one direction. History repeatedly demonstrates this principle. The individuals who reshape industries, movements, and nations are rarely the most frantic. More often, are the most deliberate. Their actions appear precise because internally their minds are organized. And organization of thought always precedes organization of results. This is why the early hour must never be treated casually. It is not productivity. It is about alignment. Alignment between thought and action. Alignment between purpose and behavior. Alignment between the person a man claims he wishes to become and the habits he practices daily. Without this alignment, inner conflict develops. A man says he desires growth, yet continually chooses comfort. He says he desires excellence, yet tolerates distraction. He says he desires change, yet repeats familiar behaviors. Eventually, this contradiction produces frustration because the mind recognizes inconsistency even when the individual attempts to ignore it. But when thought and action begin supporting one another consistently, momentum develops. Progress no longer feels forced. Energy increases because internal resistance decreases. The man stops dividing himself between opposing desires and begins moving forward with unity of purpose. This is the hidden strength behind all sustained achievement. Not intensity, not temporary motivation, but internal alignment maintained through repeated disciplined action. And as this alignment deepens, another transformation quietly begins to occur. The man no longer seeks constant validation from the outside world. He becomes less dependent upon applause, recognition, or approval because his sense of direction no longer originates externally. It originates from conviction. This freedom is rare. Many people spend their entire lives adjusting themselves according to the expectations of others. They fear criticism more than regret. They fear standing apart more than remaining unfulfilled. As a result, they suppress their strongest ambitions in exchange for acceptance. But the disciplined man gradually loses this dependency, not because he becomes arrogant, but because he becomes centered. He knows who he is becoming. And when a man possesses that certainty, temporary opinions lose their power over him. He no longer changes direction every time someone doubts him. He no longer abandons meaningful goals simply because progress appears slow. He continues steadily because his actions are guided by principle rather than emotion. And this steadiness eventually produces something the world cannot ignore. Results. Not immediate results, not superficial results, but deep, undeniable transformation built quietly over time while others were distracted, reacting, and waiting for ideal conditions that never arrived. For in the end, extraordinary lives are rarely created through dramatic moments alone. They are created through extraordinarily well. There comes a stage in a man's development when discipline is no longer sustained by force. What once required effort begins to operate through identity. He no longer rises early because he is attempting to prove something. He rises because the person he has become can no longer tolerate living unconsciously. This is an important distinction. In the beginning, discipline often feels unnatural because it conflicts with existing habits. A man must push against years of conditioning, distraction, and comfort. He relies heavily upon willpower. Every action feels deliberate. Every decision requires resistance. But over time, repetition alters the structure of thought itself. The disciplined action becomes familiar. The familiar action becomes automatic. And eventually, the automatic action becomes part of character. At this stage, the individual no longer experiences discipline as restriction. He experiences it as alignment. He recognizes that structure does not diminish. He experiences it as alignment. He recognizes that structure does not diminish freedom, it creates it. For without structure, the mind drifts endlessly between impulses. It becomes reactive, unstable, and easily influenced. But with structure, attention gains direction, energy gains purpose, time gains meaning. The majority never reach this understanding. They continue associating freedom with the absence of responsibility. Yet a life governed entirely by impulse eventually produces dependence, dependence upon mood, dependence upon distraction, dependence upon external stimulation simply to feel engaged. True freedom requires self-command. A man incapable of directing his own mind will always self-command. A man incapable of directing his own mind will always be directed by something else, whether by fear, entertainment, public opinion, or circumstance. This is why the early hour remains essential even after success begins to appear. Many individuals abandon the habits that created their progress once results arrive. They become comfortable, they assume the battle has ended, and gradually, almost imperceptibly, they begin losing the very clarity that once distinguished them. Success, when unmanaged, can weaken a man as easily as failure. Comfort introduces new dangers. Urgency disappears. Standards relax. Complacency enters quietly. The disciplined man understands this and therefore continues protecting the habits that formed him even after visible achievement has been attained. He recognizes that greatness is not a single event. It is maintenance. It is daily renewal. It is the continuous refusal to drift backward into unconscious living. History offers countless examples of individuals who achieved temporary success yet lost themselves afterward because they stopped doing the invisible work that sustained their character. They became distracted by recognition. They confused external character. They became distracted by recognition. They confused external results with internal mastery. And once self-command weakened, decline began even while outwards remained impressive. The wise man avoids this trap. He remains a student regardless of accomplishment. He continues examining himself honestly. He continues refining his thinking. He continues rising before the noise of the world because he understands that growth has no final destination. There is always another level of clarity available, another weakness to overcome, another expansion of character possible. This perspective produces humility, not weakness, but disciplined humility. The understanding that no matter how much progress has been made, the mind still requires guidance and correction. Without humility, success breeds arrogance, and arrogance destroys awareness. The arrogant man stops listening. He stops learning. He assumes he already understands enough. At that moment, growth slows. The disciplined man protects himself from this stagnation by maintaining a habit of reflection. Each morning becomes an opportunity not only to plan action, but to examine character. He asks himself difficult questions. Where have I become careless? Where has comfort weakened my edge? Where am I avoiding necessary growth? Such questions prevent self-deception. And self-deception is among the most dangerous forces a man can encounter because it allows decline to occur unnoticed. The early hour exposes truth before consequences become unavoidable. It reveals habits while they are still small. It reveals distractions before they become addictions. It reveals compromises before they become character. Most people avoid this level of self-examination because honesty requires responsibility. Once a man sees clearly, excuses lose their power. He can no longer pretend ignorance. He must either act or knowingly remain beneath his potential. This is why many prefer distraction. Distraction delays confrontation with the self, but the disciplined individual chooses differently. He understands that temporary discomfort produced by honesty is far less destructive than the long-term regret created by avoidance. Regret carries enormous weight. Not merely because of failure, but because of unrealized possibility. A man can endure hardship more easily than he can endure the knowledge that he abandoned his own potential through fear, delay, or indifference. And perhaps this is the deepest purpose of the early hour. Not productivity alone, not even achievement alone, but remembrance. It reminds a man who he intended to become before the world attempted to reshape him. Throughout life, countless forces compete to weaken clarity. Society encourages conformity. Entertainment encourages passivity. Fear encourages hesitation. Over time, without conscious resistance, a man slowly forgets the vision he once carried for his life. The early hour restores that vision daily. It reconnects him to intention before distraction interferes, and this repeated reconnection creates extraordinary resilience. Even when setbacks occur, the disciplined man recovers more quickly because he remains anchored internally. He may experience disappointment, uncertainty, or temporary defeat, but he does not lose direction. His foundation remains intact. This stability becomes increasingly valuable as life grows more complex. Responsibilities increase. Pressure intensifies. Expectations multiply. Under such conditions, an undisciplined mind becomes overwhelmed easily. But the man who has trained himself through years of deliberate mornings possesses another capacity, the ability to remain centered amid chaos. He has practiced stillness repeatedly. He has learned how to think independently under pressure. He has strengthened the ability to act deliberately even when emotions fluctuate. These qualities cannot be purchased. They cannot be imitated temporarily. They are earned gradually through repeated self-mastery. Others may see only external results, influence, leadership, financial success, confidence, but beneath all of these lies an invisible foundation built quietly over time. Morning by morning, decision by decision, action by action. This is why true transformation often appears slow in the beginning and inevitable in the end. Most people seek dramatic change while ignoring daily behavior. But destiny is rarely altered through one extraordinary moment. More often, it is altered through ordinary decisions repeated consistently until they shape identity itself. The man who protects his mornings eventually protects his standards. The man who protects his standards eventually protects his future. And the man who protects his future no longer lives accidentally. He lives deliberately. There is great power in such a life, not loud power, not performative power, but quiet power, the kind that influences others without demanding attention. People begin sensing stability in him. They trust his words because his actions are consistent. They respect his judgment because it is not impulsive. They feel calm in his presence because he has learned to govern himself first. This is the natural authority produced by self-command. And unlike authority granted through status or position, it cannot easily be removed because it originates internally. The world consistently searches for stronger leaders, wiser thinkers, and more reliable individuals. Yet few recognize where such qualities are actually formed. They are formed in private, in silence, in the disciplined moments when no applause exists and no immediate reward is visible. That is where, in the disciplined moments when no applause exists and no immediate reward is visible. That is where character is built. That is where clarity is protected. That is where a man slowly becomes capable of carrying responsibilities that once would have overwhelmed him. And once this process has continued long enough, something remarkable happens. The individual no longer merely pursues success. He becomes capable of sustaining it without losing himself in the process. For achievement without self-command often leads to destruction. But achievement built upon clarity, discipline, humility, and deliberate thought creates something far more valuable than temporary success. It creates permanence, a life directed consciously, a mind governed intentionally, a character capable of remaining steady regardless of circumstance. And from such a foundation, a man no longer waits for meaning to appear. He creates it through the way he chooses to live each day before the world awakens. He creates it through the way he chooses to live each day before the world awakens.